Hello everyone and welcome to today's learning session, REDD as a Catalyst for Sustainable Development, organized by World Wildlife Fund's Forest and Climate Program. Thanks for taking the time to join us. My name is Breen Burns and I'm a manager for learning and communications. Our presenter today is Mairon Bastos Lima, a postdoctoral researcher based at Wageningen University and Research Center in the Netherlands. And Mairon is working in collaboration with the WWF Forest and Climate Program. So before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping tips and reminders. Today's presentation is being recorded and you can access the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To find the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate, or go to panda.org/forestclimate and look for the REDD learning section, or you can note down this URL at the bottom of our checklist here. There are two audio options. You can listen via your computer speakers or dial in through the number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this is sometimes caused by having multiple internet or software applications open, so feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join us via phone. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send me or Jenny Guzman a message via the chat area if possible, and we'll try to get it sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. Please feel free to submit your questions for Mairon through the toolbar on your screen, and we will answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email to the place on reddcommunity.org, which is a free open REDD learning platform, where you can access a PDF copy of this presentation along with a link to the recording of the session. So thank you again for joining us, and with that we'll get started and I will turn it over to Mairon. Mairon, go ahead.
All right, thanks Breen for this introduction, and thanks everyone for coming today from wherever you are in the world. My name is Mairon Bastos Lima and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. If I may take a minute just to introduce and set the context a little bit of the work that I've been doing. Here at Wageningen University, we've got a network of more than 70 researchers dealing with different aspects of REDD+, from spatial analysis to policy and governance and development aspects and so on. And we're currently in a collaboration with WWF's Forest and Climate Program to try to advance knowledge on REDD+, and to hopefully do research that can contribute to more effective and sustainable implementation of REDD+. And a core part of that process is, we believe, this view of REDD+ that we're trying to put forth together with others who also espouse this approach, which is the view of REDD+ as a catalyst for sustainable development. And along this presentation, I will explain what that means and how we understand that and why we think that's important, both for practitioners and for those who are studying REDD. So if I may go through this brief outline, this is a very important time to be talking about forests, not the least because next week we have the Ban Ki-moon Climate Summit in New York on the 23rd. And we feel this is an important moment to highlight that forests and other land sectors, such as agriculture and also other land use, have an important contribution to make to reducing emissions, especially in the period before 2020. I'll go a little bit more into that just to set the context of where we are. Then I will discuss this understanding of REDD+ as a catalyst, how that's different from the more conventional view out there. Then I will delve into the subject of non-carbon benefits, which is an important upcoming topic in REDD and which is of foremost importance to many of the developing countries where REDD is being implemented. And then I will give you a brief update on the status of the UNFCCC negotiations on NCBs and on these topics from the latest meetings in Bonn this past June. And then we'll have the Q&A session. So without further delay, let's get into the discussion of the so-called gigaton gap. Could you have the next slide, please? Thanks. So to give you the context, and I found more useful to put some of those key numbers in writing, because it's better than if you just hear them from me. If we take the annual reports of the UN Environment Program, UNEP, on what they call gigaton gap, that has to do with how far away we are from the lowest cost mitigation scenarios of climate change. Basically, the lowest cost pathways would require us to be emitting per year in 2020 44 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. We're already ahead of that benchmark, unfortunately. In 2010, we already emitted, according to the IPCC, 49. And as we go from 2000 to 2010, the IPCC says we've been emitting each year one more gigaton gap of CO2, gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year. And as we go, by 2020, when we needed to be along the lines of 44, will be above 50, between 52 and 56. So that leaves us with a gap, which is what I highlight in the first bullet point of this slide. And that takes into account the effective implementation of all mitigation actions that have been pledged. So if we assume, and that some would say that's already an optimistic assumption, if we assume that all mitigation actions will be effectively implemented, that would still leave us with that gap, and that means that by the end of this century, we can have that much in increase in the global mean surface temperature. That's the IPCC scenario that includes climate variability, which seems pretty realistic to account for, and that does not look good. It looks like we desperately need to do something about it. This is just to set the context. It's not the point to just instill some despair in you, but it's important to be realistic about where we are, and at the same time to recognize the potential that can come from many sectors. And today we'll deal here with the land sectors, as I said. As most of you know, the energy sector is where most emissions come from, but as you may also know, reductions through energy efficiency and through policy changes on the energy matrix of countries is something that often takes a while to kick in. Also, whatever countries decide in Paris next year is an agreement to be enforced from 2020 on, but we can't wait for that. We need to start reducing emissions as soon as possible now. And a good deal of that comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use, what the IPCC calls AFOLU activities. And they can deliver immediate reductions while those other reforms are underway. We can't focus just on one sector. So this is to point out a little bit of the contributions that they can make, because currently 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 equivalent come from these sectors. That's currently larger than the gigaton gap that separates us from those lowest cost mitigation scenarios. And even if, granted, we can't eliminate all those emissions, such as from agriculture, for example, but a lot can be achieved if we put that together with action in other sectors. Just for you to, I picked a couple of data to give you an idea of that importance. So if we look into CO2 in particular, deforestation is the largest emitter after the energy sector. If we look at non-CO2 greenhouse gases, then agriculture accounts for more than half of it, notably methane and nitrous oxide, which are more powerful than CO2. So there is room for action there. So why don't we actually look into how we could transform these land sector activities? Next, please. So this is a metaphor to help capture what I want to speak on today. And this goes to the heart of the matter of how we think we can transform those land-based activities. Now, it's more and more accepted that we'd better understand REDD from a landscape approach. And part of what that means is to look at REDD and forests as more than just the trees themselves, but actually as the big picture. Looking into what happens not only inside, but also around the forests, and really looking into the drivers of deforestation, agriculture being the most notable of them all, and into how we could harmonize those various activities. So far, unfortunately, the traditional view has been of REDD plus as a sumo fighter. So this is easy to visualize. It's basically this conventional view that payments through REDD plus and other mechanisms can outdo the economic gains and the social gains from current drivers of deforestation, such as agriculture. Agriculture expands, and mining and other driving forces, they carry on because they produce some socioeconomic benefits to different actors. Those may be commodity traders, those may be local communities, or both. But REDD cannot match all those opportunity costs everywhere in the world and keep forests standing by simply paying more. There are many reasons to that. The current pocket of REDD is not too deep, while on the other hand, those businesses have been increasingly profitable. In some places, forests compete with interests such as oil extraction, such as in some parts of Africa, for instance. And other commodity prices can easily go up as production decreases if area expansion is limited. So, and even if REDD could pay as much as those activities, we would still be talking of not transforming those activities that have been unsustainable, those activities that have been deforesting and often creating other sorts of environmental problems such as water contamination through excessive use of pesticides and artificial fertilizers and so on, soil degradation, and the list goes on. So why not REDD being an opportunity to ignite a transformation in those activities and make them be viable together with forest conservation? So that's what I'm calling here the judo approach, where you actually use that strength of the adversary, and drivers of deforestation have been by definition adversaries of forest conservation, unfortunately, but it doesn't need to be that way. There is a quick figure there to give you an idea, and more than $300 billion are in worth of private and public agricultural investments take place in low and middle income countries where tropical forests are found. So it's often a matter of seeing what sort of agricultural investment is being made, what sort of land use planning is in place, and how we could use the economic and political strength of those sectors that have been so hard to stop for forest conservationists, how we can integrate that into more holistic landscape level conservations where forests can be kept. So we can talk about policy reforms in this context, but we think that REDD can play a key role as a catalyst in there, not only economically through results-based payments, but also politically. And in order to materialize that, a key element is the issue of non-carbon benefits that come through REDD actions. The moment we think of implementing forest conservation initiatives in a developing country to keep tropical forests in place, we've been discussing for some years the issues of safeguards. Right now, for the COP in Lima, countries are finalizing their submissions to the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice to discuss guidance on safeguards, and that has to do with the other environmental implications as well as with the social implications and governance implications of REDD actions on the ground. Because of course, if you're changing what's happening and if you're changing things to conserve forests, you're of course not just affecting the carbon. You're affecting the lives of people who live there. You're affecting other ecosystem services and so on. Safeguards tend to take an approach of do no harm while mitigating climate change and while avoiding deforestation. But the discussion has gradually shifted in the direction of do good and actually promote non-carbon benefits. And what those non-carbon benefits are can be categorized in three broad groups. One of them is of creating ecological benefits beyond carbon. And that has to do with biodiversity conservation. So if you think that REDD actions that prevent deforestation and that keep forests in place can actually help the conservation of some key species in all ecosystems, that's a non-carbon benefit that goes in there. The same for water resources and other ecosystem services. Obviously, we can also talk of livelihoods and also of creating income by promoting activities in and nearby forests that help local communities with local economic development, maybe gender equity and other benefits, while conserving forests. But for that, you need to take this broader scope and think of REDD as not just keeping forests in place, as keeping trees in place as if they were isolated from a system of human activities that take place in that area. Third, the governance non-carbon benefits, which are often enabling conditions for REDD Plus to be in place. These non-carbon benefits are essential, and they have to do with institutional building up, with sometimes land tenure reforms, improvements in law enforcement, participatory monitoring. Go on, this which I have on the slide does not have to be an exhaustive list, but it's very important to think of how REDD can maximize the delivery of these other non-carbon benefits, also for the sake of the very sustainability of REDD actions, for the sake of carbon permanence. Because if you don't transform drivers, you may be just changing the temporary decision-making of those actors that bring forests down. So if REDD is simply paying a bit more and being more worthwhile without transforming the drivers by just taking the conventional sumo fight, I'm stronger than you, down the road things can change. The drivers may become stronger because of, say, market volatility and an increase in commodity prices. And then suddenly you don't have the carbon permanence anymore because those actors change their minds. And that's a sort of insecurity that is not interesting to having REDD actions, and it's certainly not interesting to those who are paying for it. So the non-carbon benefits in the end may be a guarantee, or at least a reinforcement to the sustainability of the mitigation actions that are taking place. They're important for carbon permanence, not only for themselves. So, I said at the beginning of the previous slide that the conversation is gradually, of course, we're still talking a lot of safeguards, but the conversation on non-carbon benefits gained momentum, especially since last year. And the decision in Warsaw at COP19 last November was that non-carbon benefits should be incentivized in REDD Plus actions. And as I said, it's important that that takes place in all three phases. So for instance, the governance benefits, many of them, it's important that they take place already from the readiness phase, from the capacity building of REDD action, so not later on. So there is a clear message that those NCBs should be incentivized, and but there was still left open how that takes place, and there was a mandate for SUBSTA, again the subsidiary body of Scientific and Technological Device, to discuss whether there is a need for methodological guidance from the UNFCCC on the promotion of those non-carbon benefits. The discussion did not go too far on SUBSTA 40, which took place this past June. There's been different positions on it. The only decision actually that negotiators managed to get out of that meeting was that there needs to be more discussion on it, and in order to leave space for the discussion on safeguard rules this December in Lima, they agreed that the discussion on NCBs, explicitly on NCBs, will continue next June in SUBSTA 42. And if I can share a few words on the positions on the matter, which is not reflected on the, well, it's reflected on the fact that the decision did not decide anything new, but you won't find those country positions in the decision text, is what I meant to say. So basically, African countries are very, very keen on having NCBs as an important part, as a core part of REDD actions. All the African negotiators I had the chance to speak to, they were very clear on that. And one of the main reasons for it is because deforestation rates in Africa have been much lower than in other countries such as Brazil or Indonesia. Also, countries such as Brazil and Indonesia have arguably more institutional capacity in place already to deal with deforestation. So if you measure REDD payments just in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent that you reduce, that you do not emit, these countries with high deforestation rates have a lot to avoid and therefore a lot to gain. On the other hand, countries which have high forest stocks but low deforestation rates, the so-called HFLD, high forest stock, low deforestation rate countries, which is the case of many countries in Africa, they may get less money from that. So they would like to emphasize how REDD actions in Africa may not have as much emissions to avoid, but they have room to create a lot of non-carbon benefits through institutional capacity building, or we'd better say institutional, or capacity enhancement, because capacity is of course not zero, it just needs to improve. So through capacity enhancement on institutions, through poverty reduction measures, through biodiversity conservation, and so on. So African countries are very keen on highlighting the importance of non-carbon benefits and on recognizing their value too. That position is different from the positions of most other countries, fortunately or unfortunately. So actors such as the European Union, for instance, will recognize the importance of non-carbon benefits, but the argument that they put forth is that non-carbon benefits are, you know, socioeconomic benefits and so on for the countries themselves. Therefore, they don't need to be paid for. It should be in the countries, in the implementing countries' own interest to to do something that say helps reduce poverty in their country. So they agree with incentivizing non-carbon benefits. They say go for it. It's great. But we don't think we should be giving extra money or something for that. And then other developing countries will have each one their own position. And same for the donor countries. But that's basically where the discussion stands. We have African countries asking for even dedicated payments to non-carbon benefits so that they can gain more from REDD plus actions because they feel they're not going to get enough. And on the other hand, basically, most others are not keen on discussing dedicated payments for non-carbon benefits. They're saying there's no one that actually says it's not important. They say it's important, but it's like co-benefit. The thing is that the discussion on REDD payments has already been made in Warsaw, and the decision is clear that the payments are exclusively on the basis of tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So the discussion that is open is on methodological guidance, and this is something I fear many African negotiators may not have realized. So the discussion is open for, let's say, further requirements from the UNFCCC on how non-carbon benefits should be promoted and rulemaking from the international level on what countries have to do. There is open room for that. I don't think most developing countries will want that kind of rulemaking coming from the UNFCCC. They would rather do what fits best their national circumstances, because non-carbon benefits are a very broad category, and certain non-carbon benefits may be more relevant and applicable in some contexts rather than others. So there is room for further discussions on methodological guidance, but not on finance. The decision on finance is closed, is hammered out from last year. So some argue that the African countries may end up shooting their own feet if they end up asking for further methodological guidance on NCBs without necessarily getting more money for it. So this is roughly where the discussions are. As I said, they will go on next year in June, and we'll see what countries decide. If someone is already thinking of asking me where I think such things will go, I can already advance to you that my feeling now, we'll have to see how discussions go on the corridor, in the corridors on the COP, and how decisions on other issues carry on. These things sometimes are used as for bargain. So we have to see how the whole context evolves. But the feeling I have from where I stand now is that very likely NCBs will be further incentivized. They will, again, encourage countries to pursue non-carbon benefits, but without requirements on that coming from the UNFCCC, but rather appearing in REDD national strategies and appearing in particular REDD plus actions. On the ground, I think countries will want also to attract investment. They will want to highlight the socioeconomic benefits that they're creating. They will want to highlight that that they may be helping conserve biodiversity in the meanwhile, that they are helping mitigate climate change, and so on. So if we discuss a little bit what countries may do to incentivize non-carbon benefits, this is still a very much open discussion, and different countries will certainly put together different systems. But it's worth delving a little bit further into this. So as I said before, many non-carbon benefits are actually enabling conditions for phases 1 and 2 of REDD+, so the readiness phase and the initial actions before results-based payments take place. So the funding of those initial phases have to take in mind non-carbon benefits such as the governance capacity building that needs to take place. But now if countries want to pay for non-carbon benefits, because the REDD national strategy may envision different forms of payment. We shouldn't think exclusively as cash going to the actors on the ground so that they change their decision making. That's a simplistic view. What some of the more advanced experiences are doing, such as in Acre State in Brazil, is that Acre State has its agency collecting the payments coming from abroad, and then they do a number of things with it. Much of it goes in the form of investments that actually benefit local communities and so on. So it's what I say at the end of this slide. Don't just throw money at farmers. If I may have a quick word on this, this is actually some of the main conclusions that other research on rural development tend to make, is that you should actually listen to those actors on the ground and see what their needs are, often what they are after with the economic returns that they may have from deforestation, and try to meet those needs sustainably rather than at the cost of forests. And sometimes it's not just about handing them cash. It's often about building infrastructure and so on. So it's about getting them on board to hear what their needs and preferences and priorities are, and working on that together with them. So now that we think more and more of REDD from a landscape approach and that we talk about tackling drivers, talk about transforming those drivers into sustainable activities, and again, agriculture being the main one of them, we have to think of what role non-carbon benefits can play in promoting those changes. So a few systems that have been conceived for, at least a priori, in theory, some possible ways that countries can adopt to within their domestic contexts, incentivize non-carbon benefits. We can think of a premium system. We can think of a quota system. We can think of additional payments that may be bundled or non-bundled. So I can explain this. A premium system would be, for instance, where the national governments reward certain REDD actions, but give a premium to those actions that create and deliver non-carbon benefits. So, say an area where biodiversity conservation is notable could get more payments. One risk in that is that you may have a two-tier REDD plus system that some argue is not necessarily good for the functioning of the whole scheme. Some argue that a quota system where part of the pool of money goes to activities that deliver more non-carbon benefits. In principle, that's also an approach that may be taken. So you don't have to pay more for the non-carbon benefits. The money is fixed, but part of it has to go for actions that clearly deliver non-carbon benefits. And if you're talking of additional payments, you can also, countries may have to decide on whether they want those payments to be bundled or non-bundled with the payments that are flowing for carbon. So bundled basically meaning that if you make a bigger payment, or you actually give 2 payments or 3 payments in something separate. So this is something that, these are things that countries themselves will have to think of and to see what suits best their own institutional setup and what actors in their context prefer. Two quick messages on this that we think are important to put forth are, one, many of these actions to deliver non-carbon benefits, they can be combined with other commitments that many countries have already signed on to, such as the Aichi targets of the CBD, of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And if that can be streamlined within countries, that can avoid duplication and reduce conflict and hopefully create synergies in their own institutional setup domestically. And again, we think it's important that countries avoid creating green islands. So it's important that they actually use this incentive, this incentivizing of non-carbon benefits to transform the activities on the ground, rather than just creating a few areas where forests are conserved for the time being, but actually business as usual goes on outside, because there would be simply missing an opportunity to use REDD incentives, economic and political, to get momentum and transform those activities. Before I move from this slide, I would like just to again revisit the last sentence, that don't just throw money at farmers. Research shows, and that was presented, for instance, in the last webinar when we had Jonah Bush here presenting some of his findings, and showing that then those poverty reduction measures may work if they are tied to certain environmental conditionalities, to certain requirements on conservation. If you're simply tackling poverty without those environmental concerns being explicit in the payments, such as in payments for ecosystem services, local actors may get richer and deforest more. So it's important to keep that in mind when devising strategies. I thought it was useful to bring that up again from the last presentation. So if I may start wrapping up this discussion with you, a few take-home messages that I would like to put forth are these ones. So I would like you to remember that energy is super important, but forests and other land sectors can also contribute significantly to climate change mitigation, especially given the need that we have to reduce emissions immediately. The second one, that REDD should not be seen as a competitor that hopefully one day will become strong enough to outcompete drivers, but rather that we should think of it as a catalyst that we can apply in different ways, in different contexts, to transform those drivers. And that's where REDD can be married to green economy promotion. And this is a discussion that is again gaining momentum. There's been a recent report by UNEP on it. UN REDD has also published on this. And this goes to the heart of this idea of REDD as a catalyst, of REDD as an instrument for transformation of drivers, if we want forest conservation to be sustainable and to go along with socioeconomic development in those developing countries. But for that, we need a greater focus on promoting NCBs, again, also for the sake of carbon permanence. And this actually happens to be one of the main conclusions of that UNEP report on marrying REDD Plus with green economy promotion. And the other one draws from the brief discussion I had with you on the status of the international UNFCCC negotiations on NCBs, is that they will hardly get dedicated international payments. Not the least because the donor countries are not keen on proceeding this way. But countries can use the REDD payments, which are already decided that they are going to be on the basis of CO2, tons of CO2 equivalent per year. On the basis of those payments, REDD countries can devise strategies that target those development needs, especially of local actors, together with forest conservation. And in that, they should think of non-carbon benefits. So this has been a broad discussion, but I think it is important to talk about this point of rethinking REDD. Not the least because a lot of expectation has been raised in many local actors. I've been to forested areas in parts of Indonesia and Brazil where sometimes even the smallest farmer has heard of REDD and eagerly expects this thing that will give him or her a larger payment than what he or she actually gets through whatever activity is taking place there. And this expectation in many contexts has been unfulfilled, has been negative, unfortunately. So it is important that that we start thinking of REDD differently, and hopefully this discussion here can trigger further thought on it. Over the coming year, we're going to be discussing this in particular contexts to see what the challenges and opportunities are in those contexts and doing some comparative analysis. So your questions will be most welcome, both for clarification and also if there are particular points that I may have highlighted or not and that you think are crucial for this discussion. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Mairon. And as Mairon said, questions are now welcome, so please use your question tab on the GoToWebinar toolbar to submit your questions, and we will answer as many as we have time for in the remainder of the session. And as you are posting those questions, I'm just going to go to the next slide here so that you can take a look at some of the additional resources that we do have available for you if you're looking to learn more about REDD. And the top one is particularly relevant. So the top one is a link to policy briefs that were co-produced by Wageningen University and the Forest and Climate Program. So Mairon, of course, was leading the charge on that. So very relevant. So the first question to kick us off, Mairon, is how can we actually integrate low emissions rural development and forest conservation through REDD+?
All right. I think this is actually one of the key questions that we'll need to tackle if we want to effectively implement this landscape approach that has become a buzzword in the REDD community, but that, you know, has been more of an a priori discussion than actually the well, because it's a new thing. So we will definitely need to be looking more into that. And I think one way to move on with this is to take the also emerging discussion of low emissions rural development and of climate smart agriculture. There are different terms for this, different buzzwords are emerging, but they're basically about how do we actually get to reduce poverty, to promote rural development, and keep forests in place. Of course, many people will automatically think of agroforestry, which may work in various contexts, but at this stage, I think it's useful if I share with you some principles that I came across recently in the proceedings of an FAO workshop on perennial crops for food security, and I think this really comes together nicely with the discussion we're trying to have of promoting rural development with forest conservation. So if I may run briefly through the 12 principles that Leakey and other authors concluded. So one of them is ask. Do not tell the farmers what to do. The second one, and that's where I got the sentence, do not throw money at farmers, but provide skills and understanding. 3, build on local culture, traditions, and markets. 4, use appropriate technology, encourage diversity and indigenous perennial species. 5, encourage species and genetic diversity. 6, encourage gender and age equity. 7, encourage farmer-to-farmer dissemination. 8, promote new business and employment opportunities. 9, understand and solve underlying problems from the big picture. 10, rehabilitate degraded land and reverse social deprivation. Close the yield gap. 11, promote multifunctional agriculture for environmental, social, and economic sustainability, and so that you promote food security as well. And 12, encourage integrated rural development, which really goes to the heart of making it reconciled with forest conservation. So these principles came out of that FAO workshop, but I think they already give us quite some food for thought on things we can analyze at the local level to see how to integrate rural development with forest conservation.
Thank you. So the next question is, how can we make the abstract idea of non-carbon benefits more concrete without dedicated payments for non-carbon benefits? So, for example, say tropical countries don't go for them. Do you think that the idea of REDD plus as a catalyst is a possible non-starter?
That's a good question. We definitely have to make them concrete. I like to believe that the tropical countries are actually the first ones who are interested in promoting non-carbon benefits, not the least because it touches to the heart of their constituencies and to other, to benefits to their own people. So, and and this is not just wishful thinking. I mean, negotiators from developing countries are all keen on delivering non-carbon benefits. Well, what can happen in the negotiations is that there is a requirement from the UNFCCC that those actions have to deliver non-carbon benefits. Right now, it's just encouraging countries to incentivize it. The thing is that if there is a sort of a mandate from the international level to deliver non-carbon benefits, it's still, you won't have MRV systems, so measurement, reporting, and verification systems in place for non-carbon benefits, because that would really overwhelm the UNFCCC. And I don't think any negotiator, even those who want more and even dedicated payments on non-carbon benefits, they want to do it more freely. They don't want whole MRV systems for non-carbon benefits. So, and a mandate without actual verification and guidelines for reporting maybe end up being a vague requirement. So I think we really have to work with the national level and subnational level policy making onto how implemented. But there, I think that the view of REDD as a catalyst may actually be a way to further promote that. Because if we're talking of catalyst, we're talking of catalyzing some transformation, some change. And the one thing we want to change are those activities that are drivers of deforestation. That's what needs to change if we want to stop deforestation and conserve forests. So especially if we think of the socioeconomic non-carbon benefits, I think necessarily we'll have to transform those activities into something that deliver those non-carbon benefits together with forest conservation. Otherwise, they may simply not work in practice. So for the very effectiveness of the country's strategies, I think they will have to think of that.
Thank you. So, and Mairon, this next question seems deceptively simple, but I'm sure it's complex. The question is, can we measure non-carbon benefits?
Yes, we can. There are indicators for that. So, for instance, if we're talking of course, each non-carbon benefit can have its own set of indicators, and some are easier to measure than others. So if we're talking of biodiversity, a region may pick species richness or abundance as indicators. If we're talking of socioeconomic non-carbon benefits, a country or a province may look at how the income of local communities has changed. At the same time, if we talk of gender equity, then we may need to give a little bit more thought. But we can also compare. The female and the male populations in the locality through quantitative methods. So it's important to realize that indicators do not necessarily have to be quantitative for measuring non-carbon benefits. We can also rely on qualitative methods, and that may actually be needed in the case of some non-carbon benefits that are less tangible, such as some of the governance ones and some of the social ones. We may actually measure them by going to the ground and doing ground truthing, talking to people, and checking the changes. While in other cases we may actually use indicators such as the ones I said on species richness, for instance, if we're talking about biodiversity.
Thank you.
Or areas of conserved forest.
Sorry. So the next question asks or says, you didn't mention the voluntary market's role in the development of standards for non-carbon benefits. Could you please discuss what role you think the voluntary market will play in the future of NCBs?
Mm-hmm. This is interesting too because a lot is going on and moving forward in parallel to the developments at the UNFCCC. And of course there is a lot of room for streamlining that. It's important that the different systems being created try not to duplicate and create confusion both for investors and for the developing countries, many of which have limited capacity. So right now the system of safeguards, for instance, is actually arguably more advanced in some of the voluntary market, such as through verified carbon standards, VCS, or the social environmental safeguards initiatives, whereas at the UNFCCC this is still being discussed. So there are those parallel initiatives emerging, but they are more often framed as safeguards. To turn the do no harm into do good, it's not an insurmountable effort. Quite the opposite. It's more a matter of framing, and I think they actually can help a lot in prompting the countries who are willing to implement REDD, prompting those countries to actually devise strategies that do address non-carbon benefits. As I said, some of them are enabling conditions and maybe easier to expect, such as the institutional ones, and in some cases land tenure. But some others, such as biodiversity conservation or the improvement in the condition of local communities or benefits to indigenous peoples and so on, they cannot be taken for granted. So if those voluntary carbon markets, there are funding several of the pilot initiatives, such as in Acre State in Brazil, that have been fueled to a large extent by voluntary carbon markets and by funds as well, they actually have a great opportunity to start setting things right from the beginning, because at some point there may be a lock-in. If REDD national strategies become shaped in a way that does not address non-carbon benefits as much as they could, they may be harder to change later on. Countries will not be updating their REDD strategies every year. Often that is at the cost of a political process, of negotiation across multiple stakeholders, and so on. So that if that can be achieved from the beginning, and again, voluntary carbon markets, which are working as a vanguard ahead of the UNFCCC process, if they can already point countries to that direction, I think that can accelerate things.
Thank you. And we're coming to the end of our time here, so this will be our last question, but it's a good one. My last question is, if we could measure non-carbon benefits by numeric indicators, do you think that this could be used for ranking REDD projects, which could lead to different pricing of carbon, in quotes, produced by these projects?
This is an interesting point, and it's a touchy question. Because on the one hand, a certain measure of comparability is useful to investors for the simple reason that donor countries in general will want to know how good is the emission reduction they're obtaining. At the same time, and the reason why many people don't like that approach is that the context may differ a lot. As I said to one of the previous questions, politically it's very, very unlikely that we may get standardized MRV systems for non-carbon benefits, which would make achievements by different countries fully comparable. I don't think we can realistically expect that coming, which means that different countries will likely have different indicators, which may not be totally fungible. And I understand that the question asks, so, and if we could, well, some people say that's not desirable because it could again create sort of first-class REDD emission reductions, second-class REDD emission reductions that could perhaps disencourage those countries that for some reason are not being able to promote as many non-carbon benefits as their neighbor, and could end up being, being abandoned and being relegated to the sides, and that could end up disincentivizing them to pursue REDD actions. So we would have to be careful with that. But the main thing that I can say is that it's unlikely we'll get that sort of identical indicators for comparing countries. This is much more likely to be a sort of a qualitative comparison where countries report on how safeguards are being addressed and on how they are promoting non-carbon benefits, and donor countries and investors do a more qualitative comparison of those.
Well, thank you. And thanks. I know there were more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I hope you'll join us at the next REDD learning session, which will be with a new presenter on a new exciting topic. And you can keep in touch with us and keep up to date on our work with these REDD resources here. And here are some other ways to keep up with us. And with that, I will bring us to a close. Thank you again for joining us today. Thanks to Mairon for the presentation, and we will see you next time. Thanks,
everyone.